Hello everyone, I'm Bato Ruja, an agricultural engineer specializing in animal breeding. I'm the owner of Lonchashi Bator Puli Kennel and Tarka Puli Limited. Today, I'm going to talk about how we can influence the gender ratio of puppies. So why is it important to know what sex the puppies will be? Well, partly because of the breeder's preferences and partly because of market demand. As a breeder, when I plan a litter, I always decide if I want more females or males, and it really makes a difference if I want female dogs, whether 1 or 5 are born, because it matters what I can choose from later. The market demand back when I started working with dogs in the late 90s, or breeding, was that almost everyone needed a male dog. But lately, that's totally changed, and now almost everyone wants a female dog. So based on that, it is really important to know how we can influence the sex ratio in our litters. I've been breeding pulleys under the Lonchashi Bator kennel name since 1997. In January 2023, I put together some statistics. Up to that point, I'd had 80 litters under this kennel name, some bred in my own yard and some in cooperation with other breeders or owners. From the stats on my litters, it turned out that most of the puppies were males. Looking at my litters overall, based on the January 2023 data, about 55% were males and 45% were females. These numbers don't include the litters where I aimed for a specific gender ratio, so those aren't counted. I actually took into account that if I were to go into more detail here, then for smaller, medium, and larger litter sizes, I could say that in the bigger litters, about 65% were males and 35% females. So basically, the puppies didn't exactly come in the proportions I wanted. Alright, now I want to talk about the biology of breeding. Since this video is primarily meant to help breeders, this is an important topic, so let's get into it. Starting from the basics. A female dog's heat cycle begins around 6 months old. There is an active phase and an inactive phase. The active phase is split into the proestrus, which lasts about 9 days, then estrus, the actual heat period lasting 6 to 8 days. That's when the female can get pregnant. After that, there's the luteal phase, which lasts about 2 months. Dogs also have an inactive phase that lasts roughly 3.5 months before the cycle starts over again. This cycle is pretty interesting compared to livestock like horses or to cattle and similar animals. The difference is that the dog ovulates, and then for 2 days she can't get pregnant, meaning she can't take in the sperm. This actually makes breeding a lot easier for us because we don't have to guess the future. We can figure out the right time to breed based on when the ovulation happened. The sperm need about 6 hours inside the female reproductive tract to be able to fertilize the female. This is basic biology from elementary school. Living things pass half of their genetic material through their sex cells. Dogs have 38 plus 1, that is 39 pairs of chromosomes. The egg cell always carries the X chromosome, while the sperm cell carries either the X or the Y. So, whether the offspring is female or male depends on whether the sperm's X or Y chromosomes pairs with the egg's X chromosome. In short, the sex of the puppy depends on whether the combination is XX or XY. The sex of the offspring depends on the chromosomes it gets. From one parent it gets the X, and from the other parent it gets the X or the Y. If it gets the Y, it'll be male. Now, during fertilization, the sperm enters the female. This can happen naturally through mating or artificially through artificial insemination, which can use fresh sperm, cooled sperm, or frozen sperm. Usually, frozen sperm insemination is done surgically. After insemination, the sperm waits about 6 hours as it moves towards the eggs. The egg cell is surrounded, and only then can it be fertilized. So the egg cell is released from the ovary. That is what we call ovulation. After that, it usually stays viable for about 2 days for fertilization. So when should we breed the female dog? As a breeder, there are several ways to figure this out. In practice, the following methods usually work. The counting method. I use this a lot at the beginning of my breeding experience, especially good with good quality breeds, and it works quite well. For example, the pulley is an animal that is easy to breed, so the counting method usually works for them. There's also vaginal smear tests, progesterone tests, measuring vaginal resistance, and even tracking the LH surge. I'm not going to go into detail about that in this talk because it's really expensive. It's a very precise method, but very expensive and not used much in practice. So I won't cover it here. Okay, let's look at the counting method starting from the first day of the heat, which is basically the bleeding day and the swelling of the vulva. We calculate which day will breed her. The advantage is that it's cheap, and for some dog breeds it works really well, like with the pulley, for example. The downside is that if we miss the first day, then we won't know what day we're actually on or when to breed. We can't pinpoint the exact time of ovulation here, only roughly when to breed the female. We've got about 5 days to work with, but it's not good for females with hormonal issues. Here's how it works. The vet takes a sample from the vaginal lining and stains it with a 2-color dye. By looking at how the cells clump together or how smooth they are, and the condition of the cell nuclei, the vet can tell which part of the female dog's cycle she's in. The good thing about this method is that it's the cheapest among vet techniques. The downside is that it's probably the least reliable, so it's usually used alongside other methods. Also, it can't pinpoint the exact time of ovulation. Determining the progesterone levels is, in my opinion, the most common test among breeders. Many use it. The vet takes a blood sample and checks it using lab diagnostic methods. Progesterone is produced by the corpus luteum and helps maintain pregnancy for a while in dogs, or at least plays a role in it. The progesterone level rises slowly at the beginning of the cycle, then after the follicle ruptures, that is, after ovulation, it rises faster. Usually it is measured in nanograms per millimeter. The value is usually between 4 and 8 during ovulation, and it's best to breed the dog after that. At this point, you usually see a sudden spike. Vets usually recommend going for breeding then. The advantage is it lets you pinpoint the fertile period accurately. The downside is that it can only be done by a vet, and not every vet offers it because it requires lab diagnostics. Plus, it's an expensive procedure, and if you have to take your female dog multiple times, it's an expensive process, especially if the female needs to be taken to the vet frequently. You can measure vaginal resistance using the device made by the Polish company Dromiński. It measures the body's salt content and therefore its conductivity, which changes throughout the cycle. There is no specific unit for this. It gives a reference number that we compare to others. This number not only shows the best time to mate the female dog, but also clearly indicates when ovulation occurs. This is what the device looks like, and this part needs to be inserted into the female dog's vagina. The machine will give us a value. By comparing these values, we can figure out when we need to fertilize. This chart is from the Dromiński company, basically shows these units. On this diagram, you can roughly see when ovulation happens. It counts the days backwards, according to the company's system. You can see there are fluctuations, but there's a clear rise and peak, and then after the peak drops off, that's when we need to fertilize. This is roughly what the company's table shows. We should be doing the insemination on the day of or right after the drop, following the peak. The benefit is that if you know how to use it well, you can pinpoint the exact time of ovulation. Since this is a device, if someone buys it, it's very, very durable. I actually got to know this device from István Menyhát from the Pulley Kennel, and they used it for 15 to 20 years, so the device lasts a long time. The downside is that it requires a bigger one-time investment and takes some practice and experience. Using it takes some practice, and analysing the values is important. So when exactly should you breed the female? Well, it's at the actual time of heat. When with the counting method, in practice, it's usually done between days 9 and 14. For vaginal smears, the vet determines it. For progesterone tests, around 8 nanograms per ml is recommended. With ovulation detectors, it's right after the highest reading drops. But here we've figured out when exactly to breed her to have puppies. So to have puppies, there's still this method if we happen to miss the whole thing. We know that after ovulation, the egg can stay viable for about 5 to 8 days. After a while, vaginal insemination won't work anymore, and that's when surgical insemination or using a catheter comes in. Though the catheter method doesn't work as well with dogs. Surgical insemination is what can help us if we don't want to miss the dog's current heat cycle. With frozen sperm, this deeply deposited fertilizing material is the only exclusive option. So we've come to the point of how we can influence the sex ratio of the litter. We'll get back to a couple of important points that once we put them together will lead us there. The lifespan of male gametes is, as we know, about 2 days. That's true for almost every animal species, or at least for livestock. However, the lifespan of the egg is very lucky in dogs. It's about 5 days. Sometimes it can be 8 days, as we've already discussed. Sperm carry the X and Y sex chromosomes. The Green Branch book explains this really well. They say chromosomes have weight, and this weight affects their speed. The Y chromosome is lighter because it doesn't carry that little leg, the small piece of genetic material, like the X chromosome does. Since the Y is lighter, it is faster, but moving faster uses more energy, so it has a shorter lifespan. So from this, we can say that the sperm carrying the Y chromosome, which are the faster swimmers, reach the egg quicker, and the heavier, slower moving sperm carrying the X chromosome. However, since the Y chromosome carriers use more energy, they die off sooner. So the X chromosome carriers, the ones that influence female offspring, live longer. This brings us to the most important point. The closer mating happens to ovulation, the higher the chance of having female offspring in the litter. The chances of male puppies in a litter increase the later we mate after ovulation, or the more times we mate. This chart that might not be the best choice because it shows a flow chart with days on the side. It's hard to display events spanning multiple days in one chart. So let's try and make sense of this figure. I marked the egg cell with the black dot and the sperm carrying the Y chromosome, the male ones, in blue. I marked the egg cells and the sperm cells carrying the X chromosomes in red. But to make it easier from now on, I'll just call the sperm carrying the Y chromosome, which determines maleness, Y, and the sperm carrying the X chromosome, which influences the female egg, I'll call X. Alright, so let's see what's happening in this diagram. It actually shows events from several days, all squeezed into one chart, but I'll explain it. I placed ovulation on day 9 here, as we've already learned, and it lasts for 2 days. It can't pick up the sperm right away. In fact, it usually only gets fertilized around the 2nd day after ovulation happens. So if we mate the female on that day, we can see that the movement from the Y-carrying sperm, they move faster, so I tried to sketch the movement with bigger waves to show that. They'll get to the egg quicker. More of them reach the egg that can be fertilized after 2 days. The X-carrying sperm, on the other hand, moves slower. They get there slower, sure, but here 2 days pass with the insemination. 2 days go by. So what happens? They're already dead. Those Y chromosomes, are dead. So the egg cell is mostly surrounded by the red ones, or it's the red ones that can fertilize it. So basically, there's a better chance of getting a female. This isn't like a lathe where you set it to 8 millimeters and that's it. We're talking millions of male sperm, but by the law of large numbers, the more eggs there are, the more X chromosome sperm there are, the higher chance of having female puppies. This chart isn't perfect because I tried to stretch out what you might call the active phase of the female dog, specifically the part of the phase where she can actually get pregnant. I spread it out by days here, but maybe I should have done it by hours instead. If we move a few hours forward and fertilize her a bit later, the ovulation has already happened, and the egg is already there. It might be able to pick up the sperm cell, but as time goes on, more and more Y sperm survive. Basically, we start noticing that around the egg there are more Y sperm, meaning the ones that influence male offspring. From this point on, the chances increase the further we go. Hours, half days, days. There's a higher chance that male puppies will be born. And then I'm not even talking about the days after that when the Y sperm really arrive much earlier. The sperm that influence the female sex cells will arrive later. So basically there's a much, much higher chance that the mating period gets pushed back. By stacking it up every hour, every day, we have a better chance that our dogs will have puppies. From around day 9 to day 14, the egg can still pick up sperm and be fertilized. So even then, we still have the eggs that are alive for another day or two. But because of the closing of the mucus plug, now the fertilizing material can't go through the cervix. So basically, we can't go any further through the cervix here. By the way, I have a really interesting example of this. I sent fertilizing material to Poland, and it was carefully calculated when it should come out, which actually supports this theory. What happened was that the sperm was collected on Wednesday, and it was supposed to be released by Thursday. But the company, I don't even remember which one, was striking, so the fertilizing material didn't get out until Monday. I didn't envy the poor lady at all because she was really stressed out. She needed the chilled sperm by Thursday or Friday, and by the time it got there on Monday, only about 5% of the sperm was still alive. She said it didn't matter, and she had already put so much energy and money into it, she wanted the doctor to implant it directly into the uterus. If there were still any live eggs, they would do the procedure. Miraculously, it worked, and she ended up with puppies. If I remember right, maybe 1 or 2 males and 4 or 5 females. So basically here again it showed that after several days of cooling, the sperm that survived best were mostly the ones with the X chromosomes, so they ended up fertilizing the eggs. Now, how do we actually use this in practice? I'll explain the procedures here. Based on my own tests and working with several kennels, we use the Draminsky ovulation detector to figure out the timing of the ovulation. I think this could probably work with progesterone levels too, around levels 4 to 8. It's worth breeding a bit early because if we're a little too early, there won't be any puppies. But if we time it right and only breed once, there's a better chance that the litter will have females, even with a counting method. If we breed on day 10 instead of days 12 or 13, the odds of getting females go up. But let's go back to the ovulation detector tests. So what did we do with the Draminsky detector if we want females in the litter? After a sudden rise followed by a big drop, we breed right away and only once. If we want males, we wait 1 or 2 days after ovulation, not 1 or 2 weeks, just 1 or 2 days, or we breed multiple times. This data from early May 2024 with 12 litters where we wanted females and got females. To prove the theory, there are actually 3 documented litters where we wanted males because of multiple breedings. But either in heat or unfortunately we couldn't get to the female dog in time. We noticed standing heat in 2 female dogs, so the value didn't go above 200 with this Draminsky device. If it doesn't go above 200, then basically there's no heat, meaning no puppies came from it. For 2 other females, we couldn't interpret the values, and they hadn't had puppies before either. I think there might be some kind of hormone issue with them, but that's still being investigated to find out what the problem was. Alright, so here are our stats. I came up with this theory around the summer of 21 about how we should roughly set this up or use it. These are the years. In 2021, there were several litters. 22 and 23 were 2 unlucky years after COVID. Honestly, nobody really wanted those puppies, so breeders didn't really want to take on litters, meaning we didn't have much data from that time. But now puppies are being born again, where this method basically works. Let's take a look. Actually, almost everywhere here, or rather in this whole table, what happened was that there were fewer males compared to that, more females. Like I said, if we look at bigger litter sizes, like 7, 8, 6, 7, 8 puppies born, my stats show always about 65%, or not always, but generally around 65 to 35% ratio. So there's about 65% females, and the ratio flipped really nicely. For example, here's a litter with 1 male and 6 females, another with 3 males and 4 females, here with 2 males and 5 females, and these are the litters I'm talking about. These are different, those who have ovulation detectors. I collected from those kennels, usually working together, so we talked about when to breed. Except for one, everyone was a pulley breeder. Solo Teresia was the second one who managed to specifically shift the litter towards females. She's actually the only exception who breeds Cavalier Spaniels. Also, Gubachi Anita couldn't get any data from her, but she says that ever since she started using this device, she's been breeding the way the proportion of the female pups grew with her litters. So let's go through the pulley dog breeders. Well, I'm one of them, also with Fahir Kinga. I've marked a couple things here. I've had several litters with Fahir Kinga, we're good friends. In her litters too, the timing of the matings is good and it usually works out well. For example, we have some litters together that I have marked with stars. Also, at the Tangelitz family's kennel, if I remember right, they work with Armin Janos. They also work together with Janos Arminitsky, and he managed to get a litter like this. So several pulley breeders we worked with succeeded too. These data are documented, showing where it was possible to shift the sex ratio towards females, because for every litter there was interest in that. Now, moving to practice, we started measuring the female dogs. This chart, I only took the last few days from it, where we can see the rise followed by the fall. Then, if we put this into the table, I wrote down that the heating started on the 30th of September 2023, and here we can see how the days go by rising and rising and rising. So then it starts to drop. It's really important when the ovulation detector that we measure, we only compare the same time of day. So if I measure twice a day, which is probably the best case, that's how I can most quickly tell when to breed, or in other words, when to guide the mates, especially if we want to influence the gender ratio. So to influence it a lot, with this female, I always chose the evening hours because of work, since that's when I could measure the start of the heat. I'm talking about September 30th. From the rise I saw, I thought this was around the peak time, plus we're on day 10, so it was reasonable to assume that ovulation would happen soon. The next evening's measurement was 710, which was about a 10% drop. I wouldn't have bet on it for sure, but I kind of thought that this here might already be around ovulation. I am thinking a 10% drop isn't the end of the world. Since we were out in the evening, I couldn't mate her that day, but the next morning I rushed to do it on the morning of day 16. I did the mating then, and she ended up having 6 puppies, 2 males and 4 females. I hadn't been measuring her in the morning until then, so on the evening of the mating day, I measured again to see if the big drop had really happened, like after ovulation. We're here, and this value confirmed to me that ovulation really happened at this point. So I can say that I was within 24 to 36 hours of the drop, and everything was still working really well. I had 2 males and 4 females. The next chart is for a white pulley. Here, it is harder to read because the values didn't go as high. The peak was only around 500 instead of 800, but still, you can see that there was a rise followed by a drop. Unfortunately, I didn't write down the details exactly here. In the table, I roughly knew the day that the female dog started her heat. I saw the values fluctuating around 380 and 350. When it hit 530, that seemed suspicious. It was showing a high value for her. The next day, it dropped to 440, which is about a 20% decrease. I think this was around the 10th day, so I was eager to breed her that day. I measured the dog in the morning, but unfortunately they couldn't take her in. The day before, and basically the next day, I only got there by the afternoon. So the next morning I went back and they showed me that there had indeed been a big drop, meaning ovulation had already happened around here. I only got there in the afternoon once. I did mate her once, but by then I had given up on wanting a female. So I was a day late, and out of the 5 puppies, I got 3 males and 2 females. This is basically an example of a delay. At the 20% drop, we should have already mated her. It didn't work, and here it dropped down to around the 200 level, for which for this device is basically the end point, meaning we're back to the resting phase. Our company, Tarka, here's the contact info. Since we really like the device and it works great, I think it can be used to check when a dog needs to be bred or even to influence the heat cycle. So we made a deal with the Polish company and Dr. Vicky, and we've started distributing the vaginal resistance meter for dogs, the dog ovulation. We're the exclusive distributors of the detector in Hungary. We don't deal with any other animal species, only dogs. Our company also distributes a supplement called Caniprem, which has a lot of great benefits. For example, it's especially effective at increasing litter size and boosting fertility in dogs. When used together, these 2 products can produce an amazing reproductive and biological results. If anyone has any questions about the ovulation detector, just let us know. If you have any questions about tissue culture or fertilization, feel free to contact me. Our references are right here, and I want to especially mention that the Green Branch books were a huge help. Thanks a lot for your attention.